Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randee Howard, and I lead the War Horse's biannual writing seminars, where our mission is to give underserved and underrepresented groups in the military an opportunity to share their stories. During these retreats, we pair up award-winning journalists and authors with veterans and military family members. The impact of these seminars have been transformational. To date, we've trained 60 writers, and the most rewarding part for me is being so close to the people and stories that can help civilians better understand the realities of military service. Long before I was on the War Horse team, I was born and raised here on the South Side. I graduated high school at Kenwood Academy, right here in Hyde Park, and this is my first time on University of Chicago's campus. As a high school student, just blocks away, I never thought I would participate in any event at University of Chicago, let alone in front of my family, friends, and veteran community. This is a full circle moment for me. Growing up, I experienced the segregation that is deeply entrenched in our city and how an unequal distribution of economic and educational resources weakens us as a community. These experiences and my inability to afford to stay in college inspired me to enlist in the Navy. For me, the military not only offered a means for survival, but access to opportunities as well. Before I knew it, I was driven over an hour away to Great Lakes, Illinois, where I attended boot camp, and upon graduation, I was shipped to Pensacola, Florida, where I was trained as an aircraft electrician on helicopters. Months later, I was stationed in sunny San Diego. But like my childhood in Chicago, my time in the military was a mix of positive and negative experiences. I entered the fleet a young and naive 20-year-old and left a woman who was more aware of the realities I would face in this world. Some of the good memories of my service include exploring foreign countries with shipmates and even receiving a fish pedicure in Singapore. I also found the experience of assisting with wildfire fighting missions in Southern California to be very rewarding. The military was where I learned about teamwork and was one of the first times I wasn't allowed to quit. It took me a while to admit this, but I'm glad I didn't. But those memories are often overshadowed by dark times. I will never forget the time when I spoke up about toxic work conditions at my command that were well known and perpetuated by leadership. As a junior enlisted sailor, I was told that not only did my opinion not matter, but it won't change anything. I am also reminded of the time that a sailor 2 ranks my senior literally kicked me in an attempt to give me what he thought was a lawful order. These experiences contribute to my desire to raise awareness about the greatest issues impacting service members, veterans, and their families. I've been on that path now for 6 years, using my post 9/11 GI Bill to study at Columbia University School of General Studies, the undergraduate program for non-traditional students with the highest veteran population in the Ivy Leagues. While attending, I served the Milvets community as the women veteran representative for 2 academic years, and now leading our writing seminars here at the War Horse. During those seminars, I work alongside David Chrisinger, who will be leading our next panel. For the past year, as the leader of the Harris Writing Program, he worked with 2 of his students to write a white paper about how news deserts impact our national security. Thank you, Ellie Vorhaven and Graham Harwood, for your hard work on the white paper. During the next panel, Dave will explore boots-on-the-ground perspectives in news, the National Guard, and in the military spouse community. One of those people is Valerie Suttee, a librarian and 35-year Marine Corps spouse. Valerie is a graduate of our most recent writing seminar, where she wrote a moving story about the effects service had on her family, and specifically her daughter. Her husband and daughter are in the audience today. Dave will also speak with Captain Derek Moore, who is currently serving in the Ohio Army National Guard. His wife and son are watching the live stream. And lastly, they will be joined by Sam Kille, a leader with Report for America. Members of the Corps are also joining us virtually. Lastly, I want to thank you all for listening to my story and about some of the work we do at the War Horse. I'll now welcome Dave and our panelists to the stage for what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us today for this really important conversation about the types of stories that don't get told very often or are misrepresented. And we have a lot to get through in this session, so I want to dive right in. And my first question goes to Derek, Captain Moore. Derek, Captain, which? Derek's fine? Okay.
Absolutely.
Derek, you serve in the National Guard. I venture to guess that a lot of people aren't really familiar with the mission of the National Guard. So if you could just sort of set the landscape for us, tell us about the National Guard, tell us about the folks that serve in it.
Absolutely. So with the National Guard, it's one of the only components that has two mission sets. So we have a domestic mission set for the state side, and then we have a federal mission set as well. So it's unique because when you think about soldiers or active duty soldiers, service members, there are 485,000 active duty service members. There are 336,000 National Guard members and about 189,000 reservists. So we make up a big portion of what you see when you go out and you think of soldiers in the field. We're also the element that goes out and we respond to domestic operations such as COVID. So here recently, beginning of 2020, when COVID really hit hard, specifically in the National Guard, Ohio National Guard, we had soldiers working in hospitals. We had soldiers working in prisons. We had soldiers doing testing centers. So we're the face that's out there interacting and protecting the community at home for wherever you are in all 54 states and territories. As far as our federal mission, if you look at it, we have 17,598 soldiers who are currently mobilized. And within the next 60 days, we're going to send about another 4,000 soldiers out the door. So that's 21,000 people that are going to be away from their family, their jobs, their employers. So we have a pretty important mission set, I would say.
And Sam, you're here to talk to us about news deserts and what makes that much more difficult for people to understand the kinds of things that the National Guard is doing around the country. Can you speak to that for a little while?
Sure, and I just wanted to say thank you to the War Horse for pulling this together. For those of us who work in journalism, we talk a lot about the crisis in local news and growing news deserts, and we usually equate it to the impact it can have on democracy. And of course, I think in this polarized country of ours, a lot of times democracy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But viewing this through the lens of national security, which in a lot of ways, I think really impacts us in a much more unique and much more specific way is just really great to see. And so it's a pleasure to be here. When you get to the fact of, what are news deserts and why does this matter, especially when you think about the fact that, you look online, everywhere else, it seems like we're bombarded by information. We have news from everywhere. But the reality is that since 2004, we've lost 60% of our local news reporters in this country. A fifth of our newspapers have shut down. We have 1,800 communities that are news deserts that have no sense of news. That's 70 million Americans who really have no daily way to know what's happening in their schools, what's happening in their hospitals, what's happening with their school boards, with their local government, what their taxes are going to be for the year, all the things that really matter to all of us. And when you think about where most of these deserts are growing, and the fact that it's going to get worse, on average, 2 newspapers a week fold in this country. Most of them are weeklies. And where they're predominantly folding are in places that really matter to this crowd, because it's predominantly in rural and colors of communities of color rather, as well as in the South. And when you look at recruitment, there's been a lot of talk about the effect of journalism on recruitment in this country. The majority of our recruits in this country come from rural and suburban areas as well as the South. So the places that news deserts are growing most rapidly are the places where we're drawing upon the military of tomorrow.
And just to pick on that word, news deserts, a little bit, I read recently, excuse me, that maybe describing it as a desert is not the most appropriate term because that implies that it's natural. And this is not natural, right? This is the result of decisions that are being made, and it's happening sort of on purpose in a way. Is that right?
Well, I don't know that I would say it's on purpose. It's happening because the business model for traditional journalism has failed. Whereas advertising was what largely drove newspapers. When you think about it, only about 17% of Americans actually pay for the news that they get. They're looking for it in free ways, or they're looking for it in low cost. Subscriptions don't necessarily generate a lot of money, especially for your small local newspapers. When you think about how much it costs to go down to the corner store and buy a newspaper. Advertising is where most of that money came from. With the advent of the internet, it's easy to see why 2004 is kind of that year that you look at where there's been such a sharp decline in local news, because the advertising has gone online. It's much cheaper for businesses to go and advertise on the internet. It's also a great place for people to go and to see news. So that is just helping to grow it, and we really need to think about how we change those business models.
Do you have any ideas that you can throw out here to?
Well, Report for America, we think we've got part of the solution, not the whole solution. And what we do at Report for America is we're a nonprofit program. A national service program is how we bill it, because we do believe that journalism is a national public service. But we search for journalists, talented emerging journalists. Then we match them with local newsrooms across the country who are looking to beef up their coverage of underreported topics and communities. So that's one way, putting more journalists into the field. But also it's about increasing community buy-in, having philanthropy play a much bigger role in supporting journalism. So what we do is we fund half the salaries of those reporters in their first year, and then it graduates down the second year, third year, and then we encourage the newsrooms to fundraise from their local community so that they can help build sustainability in that and have that community buy-in with those reporters.
That's fantastic. And one community that's underreported on, Valerie, is military families, and specifically military kids. And you and I met last fall at the War Horse seminar, and you came ready to, well, should I say ready? You came willing to start working on a story that you've been trying to tell for a while. And so can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like for you to essentially become this witness, this testifier almost of this underreported area?
Well, it was so, I felt so fortunate to have the chance to share the story, because it took years for me to even consider doing that. The story that I told, and with the help of the War Horse, was about a mental health challenge that we had in our family. And that what I kind of realized in working through it in the writing process was that the labels that we apply to military family members, to service members, are often not helpful. The term resilience gets tossed around a lot in these venues, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with resilience. I'm just saying that when you label someone as being resilient and they don't feel like they're resilient, it causes a real problem. So if you're already struggling mentally, whether it's someone dealing with lots of deployments or just the average American there's a lot of health issues in our country. And so, if you put a label on it to a group of people who are told that they should be able to handle it on their own, it's just not helpful. It kind of becomes a barrier to getting help. The Marine Corps provides lots of services for families. I'm not complaining about that at all. I'm just saying that when our stories don't get told and people think that we are just resilient and we can take everything, we probably don't feel like we should take access to those. I never even thought about getting help during the time that we went through that. I just thought, we can do this. This is what we do, and that's what we did. And it wasn't until I had a chance to go write about it and really think about it that it started to come to light that, it's not fair. I was someone who believed in resilience. It's something that was taught to us, and over time I just thought, I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think a lot of labels are helpful. I think in the stories we hear about families, about service members, they often are depicted as heroes, and spouses are considered saints for being able to put up with it. And that's not really a good bridge to the civilian community. I'm a civilian. I mean, you know, the first bridge is between the civilian spouse and the service member. So it's kind of sad that we're at the point where we don't get to have these connections.
So it's almost a matter of the pendulum swinging too far, right? So away from this, like, everyone's broken, everyone's damaged, everyone has trouble, to everyone's resilient, everyone can take it, everyone can handle it.
It's almost like, well, lucky you. I mean, all these moves, all this stress is going to make your kids resilient. So that's a real bonus. And I'm
how
not.
many times did you move in your?
We've relocated 15 times in 35 years.
In 35 years.
Yeah.
And how many deployments was your husband on?
Five, 3 combat, 2 before.
So earlier when we heard Thomas talking about the last 20 plus years have been hell on military families, that's maybe an understatement.
It was tough. There was a definite switch after 9/11. We were in a pretty sleepy, I don't want to say sleepy Marine Corps. People won't like that. It was different. And then after 9/11, everything changed. The tempo changed. Even if you didn't have a spouse that was deploying, there's so much more going on stateside. There's so much more stress. You never really knew when something was going to pop up and someone would have to go. And so, yeah, it was tough. And it's particularly hard on kids because they have no agency in any of it. And our kids were so great about it. And I'm aware of the fact that I needed them to be great about it. And that's another level of pressure that I think we put on them, is that they kind of know we've got to move, and they're just going to do it. So.
I know, Derek, when we were chatting last week about the panel, you were really touched by Valerie's story.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a very similar situation. So in 2020 to 2021, I was the commander of the 1484 Transportation Company, and we were mobilized to the southwest border. We were down there for 14 months, but prior to that, in May, I received my notification of sourcing. My wife at the time was 6 months pregnant with my son, so we had 4 months to ramp up so we could actually get out the door. My son was born July 27th, 2020, and then I left for mobilization a month later. And with that, as Val was saying, we were in Texas for the southwest border, but due to COVID and so many restrictions in that 14-month period, I missed so much. I missed the first steps. I missed the first words. At that time, my wife couldn't come and visit me because of the restrictions of who could come and visit on the border at that time. So I had more of a relationship with the Border Patrol agents than I had with my own son. So then, as I'm going back into my family element, I'm still trying to figure out how to be a dad, because I didn't know how to be a dad until he was roughly 2 years old. So your story is compelling, and it absolutely touches me.
And maybe I can have you two also talk a little bit about the difference in the level of support or the kinds of support that a National Guard trooper receives versus an active duty family living on base.
Sure. So I can give it to you from the National Guard perspective, and I'll kind of paint the map here for you. So my unit was in North Canton, Ohio. To the east of North Canton, Ohio is Coshocton, Ohio. To the west is Mansfield. To the north is Cleveland. To the south is Columbus. So you get a little bit of everything from rural America to the city to urban America. And all these people come in one location, and they drill out of this location, and then they get mobilized. So when the active duty component goes and they go on a mobilization, everything is on base. They have every resource that they need right there on base. So they have the hospitals, they have the family care plans, they have the FRG there. There's no family care plan for my wife as she's sitting at home in Akron by herself.
What's the FRG for?
Oh, sorry, Family Readiness Group.
A lot of
So there's no family readiness group that's there to have that support. So when she needs the grass cut, when she's dealing with a 1-month-old who won't stop crying, she's got to go out there and Charlie might continue that mission and cut that grass. She doesn't have that support. So that was one of the things that I noticed was extremely difficult from the active component, where my friends would tell me, hey, yeah, all the wives get together and they talk and they're each other's support system. She never had that. So those resources are a big issue in the National Guard.
And you saw that play out in destructive ways, right, with some of your men, where they had issues with their family, with their job, because they were leaving both to deploy?
Absolutely. So if we talk about employers, there's USERRA when you leave. So that's another component of the active duty. When you leave for deployment on active duty, you just leave that base. When you leave for deployment in the National Guard or the reserves, you're leaving an employer, you're leaving family members. So then you got to come back to that same job that you had before, and it's not guaranteed to be there. USERRA says it's guaranteed to be there, but I'm going to tell you as a commander, I've watched employers not bring soldiers back on employment. So for me, it was just difficult to watch that and watch my soldiers struggle, and then with their families too. It's a whole different element, because I'm working these guys 12 hours a day, and their families are like, you're in Texas having a good time. Why can't you pick up the phone? No, they're working 7 days a week. And you know, they're seeing certain things on the border that will potentially cause them some of the issues that you guys have heard about today, because not every form of PTSD comes from a combat deployment. And I'll give you an example, and I don't want to take too much time and talk here, but I'll give you an example of a soldier that I had on a COVID mission. He was in the hospitals helping support the National Guard, and his job was to move dead bodies. That was his job, to move dead bodies in the hospital, move from one location to the next location, and then he comes to me and explains that he has PTSD, and I'm talking to someone else, they're like, well, he hasn't been on a mobilization, he hasn't been to Iraq, he hasn't been to Afghanistan, he hasn't seen combat. But there are different forms of PTSD that the National Guard sees and we face on a daily basis.
I can imagine too, with like hurricane response and all the things that National Guard gets called in to do, that is a lot of dirty work sometimes.
Absolutely. If you look back at Katrina, my first sergeant would tell you that they seen dead bodies floating in Katrina, and you got to think of what type of emotional taxing that takes on the body. And one thing I didn't mention that I want to come back to at the beginning, that I didn't mention about the National Guard, but it's starting to hit me, is the National Guard also has an SPP program, a state partnership program, that a lot of people don't know about. And we work with different countries all around the world in different partner countries. So, for example, Ohio's is Hungary and Serbia. And the important piece of this is when Ukraine went to war with Russia, who did they call? They called the National Guard, the California National Guard, to get support and understand tactics and how to fight. So that National Guard element plays both here, domestically, and foreign.
Wow.
Now, Sam, you have a military background, and you've now been in journalism for a long time. Tell us about that transition, and did that give you, we heard earlier in some panels that like having more military veterans in the newsroom will improve coverage. It'll make the coverage more contextualized and more nuanced and make it easier for people to understand. Has that been true for your experience too?
To a degree, and I think it's really important that we need representation from every group. Far too many newsrooms do not look like the communities that they're serving. So whether it's diversity of color, diversity of religion, or being military veterans. Earlier today, Ron Nixon from the Associated Press talked about the fact that, and he didn't know the numbers, but it's about 7% of our, less than 10% of our country are veterans right now, but it's less than 2% work in newsrooms. We need to get that number back up, just in the same way that we need to get more African-American journalists, more Hispanic, Latino journalists in there. We need to think about every community group so that we better represent communities, because that's where trust comes in. People are going to be more likely to trust a journalist when they look like them, know them, understand them, can have a conversation with them. So having more military vets would be great. Part of the problem with that, though, and it's a problem I found when I left the military after being a military journalist, at that point in my life, one, I've got a great amount of experience, or so I think. I'm trying to get a job in a newsroom, but I'm also a little bit older. I'm not necessarily being looked at as coming from some Ivy League school, so I don't have that on my resume, a great grad school, like Mizzou grad school or something like that. So I haven't gone through that big journalism program other than the Defense Information School, which is the military's journalism school. And then by that point, I've got a family, and I've got to worry about feeding them. So I think we all know that salaries for journalists are not very high, especially starting out. So you're overcoming that barrier. And then the fact that, when I left the military, I left active duty in the 90s and then ended up staying in the reserves until the beginning of the aughts. But coming back from that, there was a misunderstanding. There are so many stereotypes of what someone from the military is like and what they're coming into. So trying to find jobs, especially at that point where we hadn't got to a point where there was a rush in, a little later in the 2000s after, Iraq and Afghanistan were going to, we all have to hire veterans and get more veterans out there. That's started to die off, right? So it's really important that we really look for more ways to get more people in there. But also, I think they're also beyond military veterans in newsrooms. That'd be great to see more military spouses. I think it was talked about earlier. So many military spouses are very highly educated. The jobs that are in those communities, like Thomas talked about earlier, Jacksonville, North Carolina. I spent a lot of my life in Jacksonville, North Carolina, both as a Marine and as a dependent. My father was in the Marines as well. The community serves the military community. So it is a lot of bars, a lot of restaurants, a lot of car dealerships, et cetera. So what about, potential journalists there? Would love to see that take place, see more writers come about and share those experiences so that more people understand what is happening in their community.
Well, and Valerie, when you look at media coverage of deployments of military families of kids, like what's missing? I know we talked about the resiliency trope, but what else is missing, or what's being focused on too much? Is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Well, we are all used to seeing the homecoming stories, which everybody loves a good homecoming story, but it's that, or it is the negative, far negative. So I think the middle ground is what we're missing. And I think one of the things that could help are stories told by military family members, by spouses, because in a sense we are kind of the bridge to the civilian community. We're civilians ourselves. My husband did 35 years, did several combat deployments. I can't relate to what he did. Like, I never wanted to be a Marine myself. I think what he's done is fabulous. He was very good at it. But that's not my life. That is a life that I share with someone. We often get kind of depicted as the sidekick. If they're the hero, then the spouse is kind of the sidekick in this whole thing. And I think stories that kind of ground about military family members. Like, if you mention someone deploying, then maybe you should also talk about what they do when they're back in their community. Because a lot of these people are soccer coaches, or they're in church with you every week, and they don't necessarily talk about it every day. But I think those types of stories of the people in your community that are a part of the military community would be helpful, because we just miss the middle ground. We don't get much other than the really high and then the super tragic story.
Well, and one thing I really loved at the seminar, was it was all military spouses, and we had men, we had women, we had people who also served and they were married to someone who was serving or had served, and to see you all recognize that in each other, even though maybe when you walked into the room you thought, I don't know if, I know we're all spouses, but maybe we don't have much in common. But I remember one of the big insights was, you mentioned, I don't know what my husband went through, but he also doesn't know what you went through. Right? And that's why these stories are so important.
Yes, it was amazing to meet so many spouses from other services, and to realize we immediately bonded, but we also have such different stories. All of our stories are very different, and it would be nice to have that kind of coverage in the media to say that the military represents the country. We are as diverse as the country is. As Flo was saying earlier, both parties, different religions, all different types of ideas, but what we want is we want the same thing that most Americans want, which is their families to be successful, their families to be happy. And it was nice. It was kind of a microcosm seeing the spouses there to go, yeah, we relate to each other, but our experiences are different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a monolith, right?
No.
We heard that earlier too, that the military is not a monolith, the military family community is not a
And so
monolith.
you can't cover them like that. You can't just act like this story, this single story that you heard is representative. That's why I think it's important to have lots of stories, because when you just have a few, that becomes like, oh, this is what it is to be in the military or to be a family member. That becomes representative. But if you get lots of stories and you start to see, oh, these stories, while they have a theme, they have similarities. These people are all different because they are people. They're not just service members.
Well, and Derek, when you were on your deployment to the border, were you and your men aware of how, or your troops, were you aware of how it was being covered in the media? Were you cognizant of those things? And if you were, did it have any impact? Did you see sensationalized reporting or politicized reporting that you saw it and thought, this isn't helping? We're trying to do this mission and this isn't helping.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The border is a very divisive issue. So prior to us going out to the mission, I had, during one of my first formations, I looked into the audience and I told you how diverse my unit was. And at the time, I actually had the most diverse unit in the state of Ohio. And I said, if you've been impacted by drugs, please raise your hand. And I'd say 95% of the hands went up. Have drugs impacted your family? Raise your hand. 95% of the hands went up. So I said, I don't care if you're left, if you're right, if you're gay, if you're straight, if you're black, if you're white. We have one purpose, is to ensure that we stop drugs from entering the United States. I am not going to speak in assumptions or opinions. I'm going to speak in facts. That it was a fact that there was a direct correlation between drugs that were leaving Mexico going into Ohio. So that's killing our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our family members. And that's what we focused on. We focused on keeping drugs out of Ohio and helping people enter the country legally. So I didn't care how you felt about the border. It's let's do this job. And that's the great thing about the military. And like Flo he was phenomenal. He's such a captivating speaker. But he hit on it. Once we have a mission and a goal, I think that's the great thing about the military is we're so diverse and we can come together to accomplish one specific thing. But hitting on the sensationalization of it, absolutely. We heard it the entire time we were down there. As we're on the border, there's a camera in your face. You got your media card in your pocket, and you're ready to go. But they're everywhere, whether you're Democrat, Republican, shouldn't be there, should be there. Soldiers are confused at that point. And you're usually talking to, I'll tell you, a girl that worked in my tactical operating center, 18 years old, getting questioned as she's going into work. So it definitely could have caused a strife between us, but I believe that because we understood what our mission set was, we were able to overcome and accomplish.
And the unfortunate thing is a lot of that coverage was national media coverage, and a lot of it cable news network coverage. Texas is one of the states that is a leading state of news deserts in this country. So you don't have that local reflection, and the local reflection is going to be a lot different. It's going to be what's the impact on that small little town? What's it matter that there's potentially drug mules coming in? What's the impact of the National Guard being here in our town? What does that do to our structure of our town? What does this mean for our schools and our kids and all of that? So you're not getting that nuance. So it's really easy to find the vacuum elsewhere. You look for news in other places when you don't have it. And that's what leads to sensationalism. It leads to a lot of opinion and a lot of lack of facts. And then the local voices end up getting unheard in the mix of it.
And to hit on that point too, we did so many great things while we were on the border that I wish were highlighted. We had 44 students start school at that point while they were on the border. We did, I think it was over 2,000 hours of community service while we're improving the community, where the average person or the average family household was $16,000. We're going back and we're putting money in the community. We're helping in shelters. We're helping with cleaning schools. We're helping cleaning parks. And those are the things I wish would have gotten highlighted to say, while these guys are doing a potentially political mission, they're out there doing really good things for the community too, because that's who we are as a National Guard. We take care of our communities.
And that's something you find in local news in a way you don't find in national news. It's about community. Because that reporter who's working that beat in your community, they're part of the community. They go to the grocery store that you go to. Their kids might be on the same sports teams, going to the same schools. So they're not out there to get you, you know? They're out there just to report on what's happening, like what matters to you as a resident of that community.
Sam, what are other kinds of stories that you think are not being done the way they should be done or aren't being done at all?
Well, the problem with the lack of coverage is the fact that most media outlets can't really devote themselves to beat coverage in the way that they used to. You know, the idea of a beat reporter who's out there, this reporter covers education, this reporter covers health, this reporter covers government, so they're sitting in the city council meeting, et cetera, or the school board meetings. You don't have that. And so if you're not going to have that, you're definitely not going to have the military affairs or veterans beat reporter that's there. You know, it was hit on earlier, you know, by Thomas that he was one of the last beat reporters for the Jacksonville Daily News covering Camp Lejeune, which is the Marine Corps' largest base on the East Coast. The whole community is very centered and tied around that. I remember when I worked in that public affairs office in the 90s, not only did we have beat reporters from the Jacksonville Daily News, we had the Wilmington Star, we had each one of the local television outlets, the radio stations. They were constantly trying to get on base to cover stories, you know, and we almost had to push them away at times. Whereas now you don't have that. And then on the base itself, even the military itself is not doing the amount of coverage that it used to. Camp Lejeune used to have a newspaper called The Globe. I was proud to write on that weekly newspaper each week. That is now gone. It's gone the way of everything else. So the base itself is not just getting, while we didn't do investigative journalism at the Globe, obviously being a military publication, we were talking about what mattered at what was happening at Camp Lejeune High School or in the elementary schools. We were talking about, issues related to the hospital and any changes that were taking place to care that people needed to know about, what families needed to know who lived on that base, because we forget about the fact that living on those bases aren't just the military members in the barracks. There are big housing communities there with families who are living, working, playing, doing all the things we do out in the rest of the civilian world. And they're not getting the coverage that they once had either. And so where do they go for information? It's really important that we really start to look at the fact that the local news ecosystem is what holds up the rest of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. A lot of the big stories that come out, some of the ones that were talked about earlier today, while Secretary McDonough was here, about the employee health records, I was really glad to hear Kelly mention the name of one reporter named Orion. Orion Donovan Smith is a reporter for the Spokesman Review. Happy to say he's a Report for America Corps member, but he is constantly looking for that connection, that local connection as to what does that electronic health system mean there in Spokane, Washington. That story ends up getting picked up by Military Times, Stars and Stripes, other publications where the story gets bigger and you start to see the bigger picture. But most big national stories like that end up starting at the local level. And when we don't have those beat reporters covering those specific beats, we lose that.
Are there any other mechanisms or strategies that are on the table to try to get to those local stories, absent, reopening a newsroom and hiring beat writers, which may not be fiscally possible?
Well, obviously, we're trying, and other organizations are trying to get more reporters out into the field, because that's the number one thing we need. We also need to really develop media literacy with our youth, and our Corps members do service projects to help work with youth on student newspapers, things like that, teach them about journalism. Are they going to become reporters one day? Maybe, maybe not, but maybe we inspire them to do that, or at least have a better understanding of how it is you parse through all that information that's out there and know what real news and fake news might be. And I think there's a lot of work, of course, as newspapers fold. There are a lot of digital newsrooms that are starting up, which is great, and we'd love to see even more of that, but most of them are starting in your bigger cities, in your communities that have more people to absorb that news and who have broadband access to actually see it. We have a lot of this country that doesn't even have internet access. So before we can fix those issues there where they have no news, digital news be a great way, but they have to have access to the internet to begin with. So there's a lot of work that has to be done.
And Valerie, you and your husband were really active, and I kind of forget the title of it, the Wounded Warrior Battalion.
Oh,
Can you
yeah.
talk about that?
Yes. My husband was the CO of the Wounded Warrior Battalion East at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and it was probably one of the most stressful times of, I'll say, my life, which is saying something since he'd done many deployments, but it's a very challenging issue, right? I mean, how do you take care of the people who serve this country, go put themselves in harm's way, and then come back and have things that they have to deal with? It was probably the most rewarding time that we had, but it was a lot, and I don't think that those stories get told very often. I was talking to someone earlier about the fact that may have been these gentlemen, about how physical injuries are very obvious to people when people come back, but a lot of service members come back with things that are not readily apparent to
Traumatic
people.
brain injury, post-traumatic stress,
Right,
toxic
lots of
exposure.
things. And when you have like the service members, the Marines that were in Wounded Warrior Battalion were there because they had additional stressors in their lives too. So I would just, I can't speak much to that topic other than to say that the people that are in that situation, the Marines and their families that were in that battalion, are Marine families just like mine. They just had additional things that they had to deal with, and while we want to lift them up and try to give them the best opportunity to transition, because that's what a lot of them are going to do out of that type of a battalion, is transition to civilian life, which we know is challenging of the best of circumstances when you leave the military, the way you want to or choose to. Like Thomas, when you have to go, and not necessarily what you chose, it's even harder. So just recognizing that they served, their families are just like ours. I think that, again, it's another way to kind of lift that label and stigma so that these are somehow broken Marines or broken families. They're not. But it's a challenging topic. And it's not over. I mean, it's not over. There's still a lot of people that deal with a lot of things. So.
Well, and Derek, you mentioned in our call, you said there were 9 service members injured in Syria recently, and it sort of was a surprise to a lot of people that they were National Guard.
Yeah, so in that day, my boss and I, we were actually in a coffee shop, and it goes across the bottom of the screen, and it says 9 soldiers injured in the Middle East. But people don't realize those are Ohio soldiers, those are Michigan soldiers, those are South Carolina soldiers. My boss just made a comment yesterday. So I'm aide de camp for Brigadier General Woodruff, who's the Assistant Adjutant General for the state of Ohio. And I'm privy to a lot of different conversations, and he walks in and he says one of his brigade commanders in the Middle East is going to be giving 9 Purple Hearts. And it's like, where are those stories? Where are those stories? Because it will tell you soldiers. So when you think of soldiers, you're thinking of that active component. But right now, the majority of the people that are actually serving in the Middle East are National Guard soldiers.
And that goes to why we need to really train journalists to better understand, or at least try to understand and ask those questions to learn those things, so that we're not making mistakes like that, or making the mistakes that Ron talked about earlier about, a marksman badge. Ooh, he's scary. A marksman badge means you barely qualified in the Marine Corps. You just made it. So understanding what those differences are is really important. So I think, the great thing is folks like the AP and MVJ are doing work to create those style guides. But we really need to have newsrooms think about how they're funding training to increase those competencies so that we can better understand both the military and their families.
And that goes to the point of right now we're in a recruiting fight. We're in a knife fight when it comes to recruiting, and in the military, it's a family affair. The majority of people serving in the military had someone in their family that served, me as well. And we need those news stories to get out there and truly tell our story. And the National Guard has provided so many opportunities for so many of my friends and family members. I think about on the deployment, I had a master sergeant, E8, got in the military late. He had to have an exception to policy because he was 40 years old, barely literate, barely could read or write, overweight. He got in shape, changed his life around, started eating healthy, goes on this mobilization. He's around one of the most incredible lieutenants I've ever met in my entire life, Dan Henderson. And Dan Henderson's working on his master's degree, and this guy goes, I think I want to go to school. I think I want to get a bachelor's degree. And that spark inspired him. And then my first sergeant's like, hey, I'm going to go back to school. And those are the stories I wish more people would tell. Now that person's going to go back with education, going back, getting a better job, bettering their community, and then they have a positive story to tell about the National Guard. And really, that's what I'm looking for in journalism is please tell our story. Please tell how positive we are. Get more people into our organization because we can make a positive difference in both communities and the military.
Well, and I can say when we were analyzing the results from the survey that the War Horse put together, which became the basis for the white paper, which is why we're here today, one of the things we noticed was this feeling that negative press coverage about the military had a negative impact on those who were serving and their families. And I think teasing out that word negative is really important, right? Like, it can be a bad reporting job, right? Sensationalized, politicized, zoom, helicopter in, get the story, leave, don't think about context. But also, like, we're here as journalists to hold powerful to account when something goes wrong, right? And so can you each, with our last question here before we turn it up to the crowd, can you talk a little bit about what it's like personally to hear about something that's happened in the military that's not good, not okay, that needs to be addressed? What kind of impact does that really have on the family, on the soldier, on the veteran?
I mean, it doesn't feel good, right? I mean, we served for many years. The coverage has changed over time. And I think when the majority, if not all of the stories that you hear are negative, it can't help but, it really kind of adds another wedge. It kind of others you from everybody else because you feel like that, like when I would meet people and talk about my kids, if they were unrelated to the military, they always kind of had this like, how are your kids after moving that much? And so they're getting that from the negative stories, I think, and it impacts you.
Because it influences the people who you're interacting
Right.
with in a certain way.
Right. If they don't know anyone, like I used to dread being on a plane because every time I was on a plane with someone and they asked what I do and what my life was like, if I mentioned it, they would almost like be like, "Oh, I'm sorry,"
Really?
Yeah.
Like they felt sorry.
They just felt bad. They felt like, "Oh, that's so hard on your kids," and it's like it is hard on my kids, but there's a lot more to it than that, and it'd be nicer to just have a regular conversation about it than to feel like you've been judged right off the bat.
Right. Have some more curiosity than that. Yeah. What do you think, Derek?
So I think about it from a spouse perspective as well, because as a commander on that border mission, my support system and my battle buddy was my wife. And there's been so many times that my boat should have capsized, but she was my keel, and she just kept me steady and kept me going. And had she fell into the stories that were being told around the border, I don't know if she can provide me that support. So for me, I told her, turn off the news. Don't listen to it. Like, immediately put it out of your head, and what I'm telling you is fact. Because everything was negative that was coming out of there, whether it be about us or about the border in general. So for her to be my support system, she couldn't go to the news sources. So.
What do you think, Sam?
For me, it undermines things. We're already fighting a battle for trust with the public in large, let alone the military community. So when you see an article that has flaws in it, has mistakes to it, it's just adding to that uphill battle, which is why it's just really so important that we really strive to just find more representation in our newsrooms and really look for that deeper understanding with people. And by increasing the amount of reporters that we have out there doing it and the number of newsrooms that are doing it, we can get there.
Okay. Thank you all for answering my questions. And now we have some time to take some questions from the crowd.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks so much for having this panel. My name's Cam McMillan. I also served in the Army National Guard and also wrote about some of those experiences for the War Horse. My question's kind of on this topic of how lack of reporting of these current, you mentioned Syria, these current military deployments can trickle down to military communities. I remember being a guardsman in Iraq in 2021, consistently having rocket and drone attacks, also had soldiers get Purple Hearts, combat action badges, and really the only people who knew about it were us and our families at home alone. So if you could speak implications on military communities, but society more largely. Thank you.
You want to tackle that one?
It's more of a
National Guard. Ugh.
Does it make it harder to do your job if people don't know that we've got troops in Syria or that we've got troops all over the world?
It does. It does make it a little bit more difficult to do what we do on a normal basis, because when I go home, all my friends are civilians. When soldiers leave drill, all their friends are civilians. So they have no idea what they're doing that 1 weekend, a month, 2 weeks a year. And I think if people had more of an understanding, there would be more of a support system, recruiting numbers would go up. A lot of the issues that we face with mental health issues, I think, could be resolved through that as well. But we just need understanding.
probably also just the, when you talk about employer understanding of why it's important to hold that job when the guardsman or reservist goes away for whatever length of time it is and comes back. Because they don't understand the concept either. They just know that they're told by the law that, hey, I'm supposed to hold this job and it's supposed to be at the same level. Meanwhile, they have work to do and they have a business to run. I know that when I first came back off of my deployment in 2002, I was getting, trying to go for job interviews and, we're getting ready to invade Iraq. So it's like, why would I hire you when I know that you're probably going to get reactivated again and have to go away and I'm going to have to hold that job? It's a dilemma, and I think if more people understood what it is that Guard and reservists go through, they're, as well as just anything, related to the military veteran community, we'd help bridge that divide and make things easier. I think if people understood it.
And it's unfortunate because our media outlet are Army Times, Military Times, and the only people that read that are the people that are in this room. Unfortunately, the employers aren't reading those magazines. They aren't getting the National Guard Inquirer sent to your home, so they don't hear any of these stories. We need a bigger microphone or a megaphone to scream what we're doing, to draw attention to it and let people know that we're trying to improve our communities and make things better.
Can I add something as we're talking about employers? Military spouse unemployment is high.
Yeah,
It's very
I think the
difficult.
last time I checked, it was close to 25%.
Yes, yeah. I counted it up. I had not really thought about it before I was coming here. I have, in my 35 years as a Marine Corps spouse, I've had 18 jobs. I've had 8 within a career field. So once I decided I wanted to be a librarian, I've been lucky enough, and part of that's because we've been back to Camp Lejeune 4 times. So, if you get lucky enough to go back to Camp Lejeune multiple times, you can at least get hopefully back on with the employer that you had. And I was very lucky to work for Onslow County Public Library there. But it's a real challenge. And when I first married my husband, I was very young, and I just had a series of jobs, and that was fine. But, at the time, you could have a single person earning money for your household. That's very difficult now. You know, I mean, I was lucky that I could stay with my kids a lot and just kind of pick and choose where I worked as we went along. So that's another issue, because I worked a lot of times because I wanted to, but people have to have that second income now. That's one of the big changes from when we came in. And, you know, the other challenge is just good luck trying to have a career. It's very difficult because every time you move, even in the same field, if you're trying to get a job, you got to go back a step, right? You were at this level, and then you move, and now to just get something in your field, you take something a step back and think, well, I'll just work up. And you just hope that they'll give you a chance, even though they know, hey, she's probably going to be here for 2 years.
And when they don't, it creates some of the larger issues like food insecurity and other things that affect the military community in a way that doesn't happen. So like maybe taking a look at that, it's like easy to talk about, oh, for some reason soldiers are starving.
Yep.
Well, why? And digging into the issues through good reporting is how you can figure that out.
Right, I think there's a misconception, right, that if you're in the military, your health care is taken care of, your food's taken care of, your housing's taken care of, and certainly there are benefits, but it doesn't cover everything.
Childcare, it's another big one.
If it did cover everything, they'd have no problem recruiting anyone.
True.
You know, so, you know, unfortunately it doesn't. And people don't go into the military necessarily for all those things, but, you know, it is important that we are taking care of those who serve and understanding what they're going through.
Hello, I'm Colonel Jones, served 27 years in the military, 2 tours in Iraq. And from the beginning of this symposium, there's some common thread that I'm seeing, and that is the question, we need more journalists, and how can we go about having journalists to share the story about military? Do you all recall something that came about, and it was where children and people would walk up to someone who had on a military insignia and say, thank you for your service? That is a common thing that's said, and it did volumes to help veterans feel better. But now we need something more than that, especially the children in the military. And my heart goes out to you, ma'am, for being a spouse of someone serving our country. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
And to you, the commander for the National Guard. My heart goes out to you because I'm a member of the National Women's Veterans United, and we have been supporting a Gold Star family, Sergeant Simone A. Robinson, who was from the Illinois National Guard. At 21, she went to serve her country in Afghanistan. She had a 2-year-old daughter named Nizia Wilson. Her grandmother was going to be her guardian for just a few months, mind you. Unfortunately, in 2009, Sergeant Simone A. Robinson lost her life with an IED. When they took her off the battlefield, her comrades say that she was singing, "This joy I have, the world didn't give it, the world can't take it away." Well, our organization supported this family. We met the body at the airport, and for 14 years, we go out to their family gravesite with that family. And there are some news media, no journalists, covering the story. Well, this family wanted a home. They wanted a home because Nizia's grandmother has to move her from place to place in Chicago trying to find a safe place. And because Sergeant Simone Robinson did not have a spouse, there is no legislation regarding this daughter. And so I took it upon myself. I'm taking care of my 87-year-old, she says she's 21, aunt. 24-hour care. And this is my first time in like a few years taking advantage of coming to a place like this. But anyway, I called and called all around, and guess what? We got an organization called Tunnels of Towers Foundation in New York, who's given this family a home. And the ribbon cutting ceremony is April the 22nd of 2023 at 11 o'clock a.m. Well, this little girl, I've been mentoring her for years. She has a room at my house. She has clothing at my house. My granddaughter said, take care of Nizia when she went away to college. And her grandmother called me one day and said, Nizia got suspended out of school. One of her classmates said, my daddy said that your mother is a baby killer. Now, that was back in Vietnam times, right? This little kid wasn't alive then, so they got it from somewhere, the parents. So I said all that to say this. We talked about at the beginning that we need to change things. Leadership, absolutely. But go to the bottom. The family. In the communities, there are good news stories of what's being done to help families. Good news stories. When she got suspended because she hit the person. Well, I said, that's not the right answer. You know, we got black and white rules, but this little child, Mother's Day, when that was told to her, her heart was hurt, and she responded. This should be a teaching moment for that school, for her classmates, for the teachers, for the community. Veterans Don't Mind coming out and talking about, hey, we serve this country so that you can have your freedoms. So I think it should be the community, and the journalists can tell good news stories. When I was in Iraq, NBC Nightly News heard a story that was written in the Chicago Tribune about gun-toting Grandma Jones. Well, that was me. And they came out and they followed me on the different missions that I was doing in civil affairs. And General Curta, one of my commanders, stand up, sir. He was my commander in civil affairs. So we get to touch on a lot. But those are a lot of good news stories that I think people would enjoy hearing. Because unfortunately, there has been some negativity to the military, and it's still being passed on. I don't know if that was a question. I don't know if that was just something to say so that we can just kind of think of other ways of doing things. But thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I was going to say, one, I appreciate your service and I appreciate the story. And I think it hits on a bigger point in my ask out of this is that you let us enter your communities. From a National Guard perspective, there's typically an armory somewhere close to where you live. We're in all 54 states and territories. Come and build those relationships with us. Please, that's what we're asking for. Journalists, employers, schools, whoever. We want to be in your community and we want to make a difference because there's positive stories like that everywhere that aren't being shared. So thank you for bringing that up.
We have a question from our virtual audience. So this individual asks, do you believe that what is taught in schools and universities about the military is mostly negative or positive? And how do you feel it impacts the perception of service members and their families?
I think it's a mix. I know that when I was going to school after serving, you know, it was interesting in classes when people would find out that I was a Marine, you know, and sometimes you would see the kind of temperature in the room shift a little bit. But I think there were also a lot of times there were a lot of professors who didn't agree with me at all, but when we had a dialogue, it worked. And I think when you can create a creative dialogue that doesn't get into an argumentative state where you're fighting with each other and calling each other names and throwing about, you know, slurs, et cetera, then you can do it. But, you know, would we like to see more positive talk? I think we all would like that. But I think we'd like positive talk about everyone in every community.
Well, that's our time. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here today. And please, let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists.